there's evidence that more difficult choices are having to be made now, and actually the economy that was growing the last 2 years 3-4% on a low base, but now it looks very much as though the economy is slowing. So they've got high inflation, low growth, maybe even going into recession. A lot of the economy that's not related to the military sphere is in recession already. So again, it's tightening the noose around Putin, around the Russian economy. Sanctions help, but these Ukrainian strikes, I said, really, they cause disruptions to people's ordinary lives, but also disruptions to the economic activity more generally. So again, that's feeding into this lower growth and high inflation story.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by economist Timothy Ash, an associate fellow at the Russia and Eurasia programme at Chatham House and a senior sovereign strategist at RBC Blue Bay Asset Management in London. Tim, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, Ukraine is continuing its long-range strikes against Russian oil and energy infrastructure. How damaging has this become for Russia's energy industry?
Yeah, it's very effective, actually. Deep strikes, the percentage hit ratio is increasing. We've heard about this Flamingo drone, missile, whatever you want to call it. Looks a bit like a V2 from the Second World War. But actually, and they've been very clever in terms of what they've targeted. So they've targeted on Russian refinery production. It's very difficult to replace, because Russia is sanctioned, so it struggles to get access to buy some of the equipment that's been destroyed. They may have hit as much as 40% of Russia's capacity and keeping offline something like a quarter, and that's already been felt throughout Russia, actually, by shortages of refined products. So basically, petrol and gas, fuel at the pumps, shortages, long lines, long queues, lots of images of that on social media, and also higher prices as well. And Russia has an inflation problem, so certainly that's not helping. And what's kind of interesting is at the moment in this war, there's a lot of focus, I guess, on the stalemate on the front lines. But actually, there's kind of a war of, the FT put it very well the other day, a war of iterations. And actually, it's which side can technologically get the advantage. And the other part of it is, once you get the advantage, you go to scale. Russia's been very good at moving its economy, its military-industrial complex, to sort of being able to produce Shahid drones in large scales. So if you think maybe a year ago they could launch 100 a day, now it's like 1,000 a day almost. So the question for the Ukrainians is, as they develop these deep strike drones, how quickly can they increase production of them to really impact Russia very significantly? And actually, the West has a role there to play. We've got plenty of manufacturing capability we could put to work and help them build some of those drones, perhaps to be assembled in Ukraine ultimately. And the questions around how that's financed, etc. But certainly, the Ukrainians are hitting Russia where it hurts, bringing the war home to ordinary Russians who are, as I said, having to queue up a long time to get petrol for their cars.
I do want to come on to a lot of those kind of European models for supporting Ukraine. But in the first instance, what's the wider situation then that Russia faces economically? Because you mentioned there they've been fighting this ongoing inflation problem as well.
Yeah, look, we know, Russia's had lots of durability, right? Because they knew the war was coming, had buffers, sanctions have been relatively modest. There was some evidence late last year that the buffers were being eroded and Russia was having to make difficult choices, guns versus butter, and central bank was facing, there was shortages, tight labour markets, and that was reflected in higher prices. So the central bank had to increase policy rates. That slowed growth, caused, debt service problems for some companies. There's evidence that more difficult choices are having to be made now, and actually the economy that was growing the last 2 years 3-4% on a low base, but now it looks very much as though the economy is slowing. So they've got high inflation, low growth, maybe even going into recession. A lot of the economy that's not related to the military sphere is in recession already. So again, it's tightening the noose around around Putin, around the Russian economy. Sanctions help, but these Ukrainian strikes, as I said, really, I mean, they cause disruptions to people's ordinary lives, but also disruptions to the economic activity more generally. So again, that's feeding into this lower growth and high inflation story.
And how much does Putin or the Kremlin more widely care about the energy industry itself more than they do the rest of the Russian economy? Because as you say, the Russians have been willing to let a lot of the rest of their economy suffer a lot of the problems while the war economy continues. But the energy industry is a bit different in Russia, isn't it? Because a lot of Putin's power is built upon it, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, John McCain, the senator, described Russia as a gas station masquerading as a country, right? And they at the peaks they were generating something like $350 billion a year in revenues from energy. That's actually significantly reduced this year. Actually, on a monthly basis, it was about $1 billion a day at the peak. We're now around half that level. So, and that impacts on them because ultimately, revenues from oil exports feeds the budget, provides foreign exchange reserves that they can use to buy stuff internationally that breaks sanctions. So again, things are getting more difficult. Budget deficit is increasing. They announced tax increases for next year's budget a couple of weeks ago. Again, this idea of I guess there was a message sent out by the Putin crew that they were sustaining this war. It was great. Nothing was, it was a win for them. There was import substitution. They'd lasted 3.5 years, etc. Things were going great almost, and I don't think they are now, right? I mean, I think now things are just beginning to bite, right? And the longer the war goes on, I think the more difficult it will get for Russia and Russians.
And the White House of last week were quite loudly debating giving US Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, allowing further strikes and kind of almost deepening this pressure that Ukraine is putting on Russia at the moment. If Ukraine can intensify these strikes further, how much worse could this get?
Well, I mean, Trump's comments were quite interesting, right? Because if you go back to the White House ambush in the Oval Office, the message there was Zelensky has no cards, and then at his UN General Assembly address, or in the aftermath of that, I should say, he posted a tweet that said that, Russia's a kind of loser, Putin's a bit of a loser, the war's been lost, and Ukraine can win it. We all struggle to understand what he really meant by that. And maybe actually people have been feeding this information about how successful Ukrainian deep strike drones have been, and that, again, if they can increase the success rate and go to mass production, they could go from taking 40% or 30 to 40% of refined production out to a much more significant share of its refined production out, and bring the Russian economy and the war machine to a grinding halt. So, maybe his comments about the potential to supply Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine was meant to threaten Putin and warn Putin that he needs to get back to the negotiating table. I mean, the general consensus actually is that, Tomahawk missiles probably wouldn't be a game changer. Probably the game changer is, Ukrainians' own innovation of these deep strike drones that, are proving to be incredibly impactful in terms of both the battlefield and Russia's economy more generally.
And the method of getting those missiles across to Ukraine is under this US Pearl system, seemingly. Basically, the idea that Trump has been very loudly talking about of Europe pays and then they buy the weapons and they're transferred to Ukraine. How sustainable is that model? Because it doesn't completely substitute the quite large package of US support that was going on before this, and if I understand, will soon be coming to an end.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Ukrainians have understood that, the key constraints on the Ukrainians, right, are missile defences, so the Patriots, etc., particularly against ballistic missile systems, and then longer range missiles, the HIMARS, ATACMS, and potentially Tomahawks, etc. I think it's unlikely the Americans are going to want to supply those in sufficient scale. I mean, the Americans have made clear that their priority is China, the sort of Asian front, and would they want to, create a bit of a bottleneck by supplying too many to Ukraine and reduce their own supply. So the Ukrainians themselves have stepped up. And I said these deep strike drones that they are developing and their innovative anti-drone technology, I mean, they are filling holes very rapidly, actually. And, they could be very significantly self-sufficient. Their constraints are finance and scale. Ukraine is a difficult place to do business, a difficult place to manufacture. All those corruption, business environment issues that were there before the war are kind of still there. So again, this is where Europe can certainly step in, provide financing, and partner up with the Ukrainians to be able to produce a lot of these deep strike drones in Europe. The benefit there is, we clearly have a problem with our own defence that has been reflected in all these Russian drone activity in European NATO airspace. So, we should be looking to learn from the Ukrainians. I mean, they're at the cutting edge of defence and warfare at the moment because they have to be, right? I mean, they've had to learn very quickly. We should be taking advantage of that actually for our own defence. So I think there's opportunities for cooperation between Ukraine and Europe and the Americans as well in terms of learning from what the Ukrainians are learning at the hard end on the battlefield at the moment.
And speaking about the US, I mean, some time ago now, Trump was repeatedly threatening this idea of third-party sanctions against Russia. Is that all but been cancelled or given up by the US administration at this point, do we think?
Well, I mean, look, there's a few things. There's the repo bill, which is about using immobilized Russian assets in the US. I mean, a lot of focus on Europe, Euroclear and Belgium with 190 billion euros of immobilized Russian assets, but the US has some as well. And this repo bill allowing for those assets to be seized by the Americans, I think there's about $30 billion in the US. I mean, that's still there. I hear there's a bit of momentum on that front at the moment. And then there's the sanctions bill from hell, potentially, this idea of 500% tariffs on Russia, or I should say countries doing business with Russia. I mean, I think there's less certainty on that. I mean, I think Trump looks very reluctant to levy any particular sanction on Russia. We've had a debate on this forum about that in the past. In the end, I think Trump wants a back to business as usual relationship with Russia, even though Europe, clearly faces this existential threat. Trump thinks he can kind of segregate those two relationships, and I think the Americans quite like the idea of going after immobilized Russian assets, especially if they can be used to buy American weapons. And actually, in terms of the prior question you asked, I mean, a key issue will be a decision in Europe about using those immobilized Russian assets to pay the annual $100 billion mill to support Ukraine in this war. And a large part of that money, likely, will be used to buy military equipment from the Americans. I mean, they have it. They have a lot of the technology. Europe wants to buy it for Ukraine and for themselves. And the question is, will the Americans sell it? I think Trump will, if there's a large dollar check attached to it. If we pay for it, he'll sell it.
Indeed. Well, where are we as well with the frozen Russian assets that we have in Europe? That sort of $330 billion worth that is the main part of those frozen assets. Are we any closer at the moment to that finally being used either through a loan or by seizing the money itself to help fund Ukraine's defense?
I think we are. I mean, I think if you'd have asked me that question 3 to 4 months ago, I would have said, yes, we need to do it, but our politicians have their heads in the sand and don't really get it. Actually, it's been like a seminal moment. I think a combination of a few things. One is, J.D. Vance's visit to Europe at the Munich Security Council. I mean, it was kind of spelled out to Europeans that the Americans are no longer there to backstop European security. So Europe is on its own. This existential threat from Russia is clearly there. Look what Russia is doing by flying MiG-31s into Estonia and drones, etc., all over the place. So Americans are not there. There's an existential threat from Russia. We know the cost. Supporting Ukraine is about $100 billion a year. Whereas previously the Americans would provide about 40% of that financing. Europe is on the hook for all of it. And whereas I think there was an assumption maybe the war would end this year, now it looks to be a long war scenario. So Europe will have to spend 100 billion plus a year for many more years to come. And, it's clear that European taxpayers don't really want to do that, right? I mean, populism is on the rise, the far right in Europe. A lot of those far right politicians, argue that we should be spending this money on Ukraine. And remember that we have this money in bank account. It's Russian taxpayer money in our bank, in Western bank accounts, sat doing nothing. So you can take the 330. That would give us 3 years money to support Ukraine. It would send a very strong signal to Putin in Russia that Ukraine is well financed. It can buy weapons from the Americans and sustain the war and cause a lot of damage to Russia, and probably step up its attacks in terms of those deep strike drone attacks on Russia that is causing so much damage to Russia's refined production. So it all kind of adds up. Perhaps the change in government in Germany was pretty instrumental there. Chancellor Merz has come out very strongly in favour of this reparation loan. There are concerns. The Belgian government, which has about 190 billion euros of the 330 in its jurisdiction, is worried about potential Russian legal action. I think that's overblown, frankly. But anyway, I think European Union is mindful to take Belgian concerns under consideration. So this reparation loan idea has come up. It doesn't involve confiscation. It involves simply creatively using Russia's central bank reserves in our jurisdiction, essentially. Whereas at the moment, they would have tended to be invested in safe securities like UK gilts, bonds, US treasuries. It will be invested in this reparations loan, which will be a loan issued by European Union or G7 countries, actually. And it'd be a 30-year zero coupon bond or loan. And Russia could get paid back ultimately in 30 years. I think it's unlikely. I think whether it gets paid back will depend on its behaviour and whether it agrees to pay reparations. But it's a nice fix. It ticks lots of boxes. Avoids the legal complications of seizure, but it provides immediate funding to the Ukrainians, and will certainly put them in a much better position to defend themselves.
And you talked about some of that harsh language that we've been hearing ever since the Munich conference. One of those lines that we've repeatedly heard from Trump, especially just before his visit to the UK last month, was that he's surprised and quite annoyed that Europe is still, in some small places or quite large, buying Russian oil or Russian energy or Russian gas. He's right, really, isn't he, to tell European nations that they also need to step up and stop buying Russian energy?
Well, there's a bit of an irony in here, really, in terms of Europe actually has massively reduced its imports of Russian energy. Russian energy accounts for about 40% of European energy imports in 2021. We were down to around 18% last year. It's around 13% this year. And actually, the bulk of what's been imported is being imported by Putin and Trump's friends. Viktor Orban in Hungary and Fico in Slovakia, actually. So we have this situation where Trump is using the excuse of not being able or not wanting to roll out more sanctions on Russia because Europe is importing all this energy, whereas actually it's the Hungarians and Slovaks that continue to import that energy, and it gives an excuse to both Putin and Trump to avoid going down a greater sanctions route. Europe, I think, will be totally off European energy by 2027. It's already cut itself out of lots of different Russian energy imports anyway. No coal, no seaborne oil. I said gas imports have gone down from 160 or 70 billion cubic meters to something like around 50. It's probably going to be significantly less than that this year and next year, actually. So we are making progress.
And do those changes make a significant difference for Russia? They are still managing to export to other markets, India and China, but then at the same time we saw an attempt at a new oil deal with China fall through when Putin did the big state visit to China recently. Can Russia replace these markets if Europe does bring this down to really low levels of import?
Well, gas is difficult, right? Gas involves pipelines, right? Or you need to liquefy it into LNG, right? So you need investment in terminals, right? So a lot of the stuff that Russia has traditionally exported to Europe, that 165 billion cubic meters I mentioned, was about 50 billion euros a year. It can't just quickly divert to China. As you mentioned, there was this Power of Siberia 2 deal seemingly done between Russia and China a couple of weeks ago. Yes, I mean, I think both sides would like to do that. Who's going to pay for it? The Chinese have been trying to rip the Russians off in terms of the price. Ultimately, they're playing very, very hard to get. So nothing's really happening much on that front yet. Oil is easier. I mean, I think one of the difficulties, we've seen that with the tariff, the 50% tariff on Indian oil imports from Russia, is, it's a delicate balancing game for Western countries, right? I mean, you want to reduce export receipts to Russia, but if you stop Russian exports completely, you risk destabilizing global energy markets and hurting yourself with much higher prices. So, and actually the 500% tariff that the US administration or Congress have suggested, I think would probably do that. It would completely stop the 10 million barrels a day of Russian oil that goes to markets, about 10% of global supply. I mean, that would create, systemic risk globally. So I don't think we want that. I mean, so you need to think a little bit cleverer. I mean, G7, or Europe actually, has reduced the oil price cap from $60 a barrel to 46. There are lots of ways that we can, and that again it reduces the revenue per barrel of oil that Russia gets without completely stopping the supply of that oil to market. So you are stopping the revenue stream to Russia, and we can certainly tighten up secondary sanctions around that kind of business. Now, I think it is happening. I think it is helping to restrict the energy receipts that Russia is getting. As I mentioned, you go back to 2022, and Russia was getting about $1 billion a day from energy exports. That's down to around less than 500 million now. So, that's really going to cause a lot of problems for Russia's budget and its balance of payments and its economy more generally.
Briefly about some of the states in Europe that are not fully on side with putting this amount of pressure on Russia, Hungary being one. There's now perhaps a new one after the Czech elections. Populist Andrej Babis has come to power. The Czech Republic has been quite crucial in helping supply weapons and support for Ukraine. Should we be worried that they, as a European state, could now go the other way?
Well, look, it's a trend, of populist leaders coming back to power. And we saw in the Polish elections recently something quite similar. Look, I think Babis is quite an opportunist character. I don't think he's in the same class as perhaps Orban or Fico. I don't think necessarily he's a complete Russian stool. I think he will. In the end, also, Germany cracks the whip in Europe, and I think the Germans have made clear that they see national security as the number one problem for Europe. They write the checks for Europe more generally, and I think Babis will kind of play ball. I mean, I think that as you mentioned, munitions. Czech Republic has led the 155mm shell alliance in Europe. Actually, that's been very beneficial for the Czech economy, right? Czech companies have made a lot of money from that. So I'm not sure in the cold light today, post-election, that even Babis would want to push back on that if it's bringing dollar receipts or euro receipts into the Czech economy, right? He's clear about migration. He's clear about environmental issues. He is Eurosceptic. But I don't think he's necessarily pro-Russian. I think he does understand the risks from Russia. And actually, the Czech Republic still has a president in Pavel who, is I think clearly understands the risks from Russia. Ex-NATO general is the president. So there are some checks and balances in the Czech Republic, and I don't think it's going to be as much of a concern as in Slovakia and Hungary. And actually, in Hungary, Orban faces elections next April. Opinion polls are looking very bad for him. He may get booted out. So, this time next year, we may end up with a weakened pro-Russian bloc in the European Union. Remember also, I mean, in Romania recently, the concern was that we'd see a far-right pro-Russian politician win the presidency and then be elected as prime minister in the government. That failed to happen, actually. The voters there voted for a pro-European candidate. So, I mean, it's a bit complicated in Europe ultimately, right? But I think the dominant countries in Europe, the Germans, the French, the Brits, the Scandis, the Balts, they all get it, right? They understand that the number one threat to Europe in terms of its national security is Russia. We need to work together. We need a common European defence and security apparatus, and finance is important for that. So, I think we are making some progress.
And just to finish, Tim, we've seen some pretty significant Russian strikes on Ukraine in the last few days, Lviv being hit as well recently. We talk a lot about Ukraine trying to create more domestic weapons. Is there a threat there of Ukraine having its war economy threatened the same way Russia is right now? I mean, how is Ukraine at the moment in terms of its resilience to ongoing Russian strikes and its economic situation?
Well, as I said at the start, I mean, it's a battle of iterations, right? I mean, the Ukrainians are doing well deep strike. Russia learns in terms of its ballistic missile capability. They are learning. Patriots, the US missile system, was very effective at one point in recent months, and now the Russians have kind of learned and figured ways to get around it. So, it's a cat and mouse game. On the drone strike front, the Russians have been able to put Shahed drones into huge mass production. That's a huge challenge, and it can overwhelm air defences. It has been overwhelming Ukrainians' air defences recently. But the Ukrainians I've spoken to recently have been quite optimistic about an ability to get ahead in terms of countering Shaheds, etc. And hopefully we can use a bit of that technology to counter the threat that we're seeing now against our airports and other critical infrastructure in European NATO. So we need to learn from those guys. But yes, there are clearly risks. The Ukrainians have proven resilient so far, and I think there's more confidence actually at the moment in Ukraine in terms of their ability to survive and ride through this. And again, I think the deep strike capability they're excelling at in the moment in the drone space seems to be part of that optimism.
Well, Timothy Ash, Associate Fellow in the Russia and Eurasia Programme at Chatham House, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
My pleasure, thank you.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.